The Bush administration rebuked Israel publicly for this because of a high number of civilian casualties, collateral damage.
Bush did.
Bush did. Dick Cheney was in that White House, just want to, as a reminder.
Was he aware that they did that?
In 2006, also Bush, Israel and Hezbollah have this war. On 2 occasions, the Israelis tried to assassinate Hezbollah's leader, Nasrallah, and they struck his bunker but couldn't get through. Not because they didn't have, but because the US would not allow them to use the weapons that could blow up the bunker, not because they didn't want to stop the Israelis, but because the damage that it would do to the entire neighborhood and all the collateral damage. So twice they tried, but with the limited amount they could, but they failed. Bush. 2024, the Israelis assassinate Nasrallah.
Right.
Blow up his bunker using 80 2,000-pound bombs. Kill probably another 300 to 500 people in that entire neighborhood.
Yeah.
And they get a congratulatory note publicly from the Biden administration. So just see the distance. A rebuke for 9 dead to a congratulation for something around 300 to 500.
You want to go kill someone who's listed as a terrorist and, could be agreed upon by other countries as a terrorist. Okay. That's where I run into the issue, though, how you do it. And my buddy Brandon Buckingham, I don't know if you've ever seen his channel. He does all kinds of documentaries. But he was supposed to go to India for, I don't even know what the fuck it was, for some documentary. This is late summer 2024, I want to say. And basically he's he's on his leg flight there, and then something goes wrong with the visa, so he can't get into Israel or into India. And so he's like, well, I'm already out here halfway around the world. Let me find a place to go. Goes to Lebanon. Happens to go the week where the bombing starts.
So what year is this?
This is 2024.
Wow. He doesn't follow the news, or?
Well, he does, but like he gets there and the bombing starts. Okay. And his dad's like hitting him up like your girl is pregnant, like you need to get home, like the whole bit, but Brandon is about being on the ground. So he does this amazing like hour and 20-minute documentary, interviews all kinds of Lebanese civilians on the ground, just very nuanced and real like a great human piece. All of them are dead. All of them. Oh. They're all gone.
Yeah.
It's a relic already. It's not even a year and a half old.
Yeah.
And that's where, and I don't care who it is, like my country did it too in Iraq. I don't care what country it is. I will always call it out. Like the collateral damage that, not the tip of the spear, but the suits in back rooms order to happen. This is how you create the next generation of quote-unquote terrorists.
Yeah. Right. Absolutely. Again, and we have norms around this, what is permitted and what is not permitted. And the Biden administration completely lifted all of those and allowed Israel. I mean, that's part of the reason like bombing hospital. Doesn't matter if you think or if there even was a Hamas cell. There's still not a single piece of evidence that there was.
That there was what?
A Hamas cell underneath the hospitals.
There's no evidence of that?
There's no evidence of that. But even if it was, it's still not permitted. I mean, there's international law is quite clear on these different things, right? But they lifted all of those restrictions. Now that led to an Israel that just felt completely unrestricted and unhinged. In the last 2.5 years, they've bombed 7 countries in the region. One of those countries is a strong US ally, Qatar, who hosted Hamas because the US asked them to host Hamas.
Did you see the picture of the phone call in the Oval Office when Trump made Netanyahu?
Made him apologize. We'll get to that. But let's see what happened up until that point. Qatar's air defense systems are all American because the U.S. has one of its largest bases in Doha, right outside of Doha. Didn't even get activated. So now, put yourself.
Didn't even get activated.
Didn't get activated. The Israelis hit. They failed to kill the people that they were trying to kill, but they were there to negotiate the latest version of the release of the hostages. And the Israeli strike. So you're sitting in the region. Let's say you're Saudi Arabia. Your entire security is in the hands of the United States, right? You put all of your security eggs in that basket. And as much as you needed that because you had an enmity with Iran and you needed American protection from Iran, in the back of your head, it's always good to have that relationship with the United States because that is a protection against Israel if anything ever goes wrong, right? But now the United States is like, well, Israel can do whatever it wants. It can even bomb a country that we formally are supposed to protect or informally supposed to protect, and we have our base there. And the system apparently doesn't even get activated when the Israelis do it. So what do you do in that scenario? Well, you start to realize you can't have all your security eggs in one basket. You need to diversify. You can't completely rely on the US. So a couple of weeks later, announcement that there's a pact between Saudi Arabia and Pakistan will provide Saudi Arabia with a nuclear umbrella.
With a nuclear umbrella?
Nuclear umbrella, because the Pakistanis have nuclear weapons.
Uh-huh.
Right? At the same time, you start to think, well, if our alliance with the United States doesn't protect us against Israel, then we need to find some new constellation in the region that can balance against Israel. And though, as a result, now you see the Turks, the Saudis, to a certain extent, perhaps even the Qataris and the Pakistanis coming together. And it's not because they want to have an enmity with Israel, but they need to have their own security. And they feel that Israel right now is unhinged. The US is allowing it to do almost what it wants, even though you're right. After they did this, the entire region went to Trump and complained. And as a result, they had that rebuke, and they even had Netanyahu call the emir from the Oval Office, reading from a written apology. And in the back of that room, I don't know if you noticed, there's a Qatari diplomat sitting in the Oval Office to also observe it from this side of the telephone. No other American president has ever done this to Israel, to the best of my knowledge. There's a huge difference between Trump and Biden in the sense that I think a lot of things that Trump is doing right now in terms of border peace, etc., is also highly, highly problematic. But we saw no pressure from Biden at all on Israel after October 7th. Just nothing. Now, where does Iran fit in all of this? Well, Iran is not part of that constellation, formally, between Saudi, Pakistan, Turkey. But informally, it is a buffer between Israel and these states. If there is a war and the United States completely defeats Iran, the Israelis bomb Iran, it's either chaos or a very weakened Iran, or perhaps even a pro-Israel puppet that is installed in Iran. From the standpoint of these countries who otherwise have no love for the Islamic Republic and have no reason to have love for the Islamic Republic, it's actually a very bad development, because this then strengthens the Israeli position vis-a-vis them. They see Israel now, they explicitly say that Israel is seeking regional hegemony. And Iran is a buffer between them and the Israelis here. And this is part of the reason why these states have taken such a strong position in trying to prevent the war that we're marching towards right now. It's not just because of the instability, that's there. It's not just because of risk of a civil war spilling over, that's there. It's not just because of the refugee flows, that's there. But that was always there at a moment when some of them even were in favor of a war. The reason why they're all now against the war is because of this new geopolitical scenario that has been created, in which they need Iran as a buffer, not as a partner, not an ally, but as a buffer.
Almost like the hostage negotiator in a way. You know, that like in those old westerns where one side sends a guy to just sit with the other side while they're actually over here negotiating, and that guy is just like playing cards, but if it goes bad, he gets shot. It's kind of like Iran's that. That's interesting. Yeah, not to make light of it. I know that is obviously extremely personal, but nonetheless, I didn't realize that scenario at all. That's why I bring in people like you. I learned this stuff. You got your finger on the pulse. But what, I got off it. There's something I did want to go back to at the initial history. You had said you remember the conversation you had with your dad when you said goodbye to him when he was going back.
Yeah, we were at the airport. Yeah.
Did you have, you're 4.5 years old. Did you have any concept whatsoever of what he was doing?
No, not then. Not at all. Look, it's very important to make distinction between economic refugees and political refugees. If you're an economic refugee, or refugee might be the wrong word, but if you're migrating to another country for economic reasons, you're actually deliberately trying to start a new life in another country. You're going there, you are consciously saying goodbye to the old country, and you're openly embracing the new country.
Ellis Island.
Exactly. I mean, they're coming in, they're Americans. They come here because they want to be Americans.
Right.
When you're a political refugee, you're involuntarily leaving a place, and oftentimes mentally you're still there, and you're just waiting with the suitcase packed underneath your bed to go back, right? Because you didn't come to this place to actually stay. You didn't come here to make a new life. You came here temporarily because the situation is bad, and then you're planning your return. When you have that mentality, I think one of the things that comes with it is that both me and my brother, who's 2 years older than me, you know, we weren't told, oh, we're going to be here forever. You know, we were told explicitly, no, this is just something we have to do. We're going to go back to Iran. Right? Because that was the plan. That was the intent. It didn't end up happening that way at all. And it's been 47 years now. But given that, you actually become much more aware of what is going around. Add to that another aspect that is perhaps a bit unique to Sweden. So Sweden was extremely generous in terms of having a very open policy for refugees. So it was a very open country. It took in a lot of refugees from countries that had wars. So the folks I grew up with in what was then essentially the immigrant ghettos of Sweden were from Chile, who had fled 1973 because of the coup against Allende, which also incidentally CIA coup, that one too.
Well, you know, when in Rome.
When in Rome, there was Romans. Other refugees from other war zones. All of us had similar stories. So that was a normal thing. You know, so we were not like the different ones. And as a result, we kind of kept it below the radar. Everyone had stories like this. Everyone had fled some sort of a war. So it was just a very natural thing. So it wasn't hush-hush. It wasn't something that was kept away from you because everyone else in your surrounding, whether they were Iranians or Chileans or from whatever other country they were, had the same story more or less.
As you were growing up, first of all, do you remember anything from Iran?
I do. And it's interesting enough, I apparently remember more than my brother, who's a year and a half, 2 years older than me. So I have a lot of vivid memories from about 2.5. And I remember very vividly, my dad had left before us to just settle, you know, make everything clear in Sweden before we came. And things got really bad in Iran. And we had to go to the embassy several times. And my mom had to bring me with him because couldn't get the documents unless I was present, even though I was just 4 years old. And I remember, you know, the soldiers. I remember we were shot at one point, and, you know, more in the era, I think, to disperse the crowd. And I got separated from my mother at one point, etc. I don't remember exactly how we got reunited, etc. But yes, I remember because it was a lot of traumatic things that happened. Again, don't want to overplay it. People have had way worse stories than this, but I do remember it.
As you were growing up, though, you know, because it's impossible for me to relate to a situation like this. So when I have conversations like this, it's another like important reminder of like how happy I am to be born where I was born. It's like winning the lottery. You know, we haven't had to deal with this kind of stuff here, and you know, that's such a lucky thing. But as you're growing up and you only have limited memories and you were only in Iran for a short time, and your reality is you're growing up in Sweden and you're growing up around a lot of different people from a lot of different places as well. Was there, you know, did you naturally develop a real yearning and feeling about your Iranian roots, or was that something also your parents kind of had to like ingrain in you and remind you of what that was because they understood it fully?
Yeah. So it goes back, I think it's a great question. I think it's also something that might be useful for your audience because the United States is truly very different in this sense than growing up in Europe. And I don't want to knock Sweden. I had a fantastic upbringing there. It's a great country. But it is very different. First of all, going back to what I said, because we were not economic migrants, we were involuntarily leaving and had no plans to stay. the Iranian identity was actually very strong because there was no active effort to become Swedes. That wasn't the plan. There was no reason to do that. In fact, I don't think I even applied for Swedish citizenship until 15 years after having lived in Sweden, even though I probably could have after a couple of years. So that was partly it. But there's also another aspect, I think, which is the difference between Europe and the United States. I came here as an exchange student in 1991. And I had visited the U.S. several times, loved the U.S., had family members who lived there. And it was quite an eye-opener for me because you step off the plane. Not only do you feel like an American, you're treated like an American, right? Now, I have Middle Eastern features, and I can tell you in Belmont County, Ohio, that was quite unusual. But still, it wasn't like, oh, it must be because you're a foreigner. I mean, you were not treated differently. But my features in blonde, blue-eyed Sweden really stick out, right? Yes. And you were never really treated, at least not when I was growing up, as a Swede. You were always treated as if you were an outsider. Not necessarily in a hostile way, but nevertheless, it was always there. Things may have changed, but I haven't been in Sweden or lived in Sweden for 25 years, so it may have changed. But it meant that for us who grew up there, at least in that generation, we kind of felt rejected by Swedish society. We were outside society, which then meant that we then kind of embraced our other identity even stronger as a result. And I noticed it when coming into the US and meeting other Iranians here, etc., that I felt like, okay, they clearly had something different. They had a very strong American identity. You would not have found that in Sweden with a lot of Iranians having a very strong Swedish identity, at least not back when I grew up. It may be changed now, because it's, time has passed, etc. But there is something about this country that really embraces you. At least when I came here, I can't speak about the recent folks that have arrived. And the sense that you're actually automatically assumed to be American in a way that never was the case. And those are some of the factors that actually led to a stronger identity, because you were rejected by that one, so you double down on the other one.
That's also a great point, because we take that for granted here. Outside the studio, I have a picture of Bill the Butcher from Gangs of New York.
Yeah.
See that movie?
Yeah.
So I think about that a lot, because that takes place in like the Civil War years in America, in New York City, where there was much more of like one kind of Anglo identity in America. It's just before the immigration surge starts. Yeah. And they would recognize the Irish as like outsiders. You're not from here. And it's just crazy to think about, especially in New York, like ground zero for this. 20 years later, you have people from every country around the world coming in, which has created this melting pot, which I think is a beautiful thing in this country, to the point that when people come here and are like excited to be here and become a part of society and all that, like, there's a lot of places that are like, oh, cool. It's just normal, because we don't have that. I'm not even blaming the Swedes. Yeah. Like, they know one identity. Yeah, you know what I mean?
And to their defense, there were never any major refugee flows to that northern part of the world until about 50 years ago. Yeah. Right? So the type of cultural traits that you develop when you are a melting pot, or when you're a country like Iran that had the Silk Road go through it, and you had armies from 50 different directions coming in and out, it just creates a different type of culture. But if you're kind of isolated up in the north, you can't blame them for not necessarily having that naturally. Can I ask you, are you Irish or Italian? Or both? Both, okay.
50-50.
50-50, okay.
You're in New Jersey. It's on brand,
exactly.
You know what I mean?
Normal thing.
Yeah, that's funny. You asked that. But what...
So I was kind of both right.
Yes, absolutely. Another thing I've been thinking all day, I forgot to ask you, like, since 1989, it's been Khomeini who's been the supreme leader. I want to get to that in a minute. Khomeini, the original Ayatollah until 1989, who came in and did the revolution. What made him so charismatic and drew people to him, other than him, yelling Shah bad?
Well, because he yelled much more than that.
Yeah.
First of all, one thing that oftentimes is not understood in the United States, or it's not that it's understood, it's just not known, is that these Ayatollahs have written like 50 books. You don't become an Ayatollah without having like huge... I mean, it's similar to like a pope, right?
Are they good?
I haven't read a single one, so I won't judge. But they don't go up in ranks just randomly.
Yes.
Right? I mean, same thing with the Pope. You have to have a tremendous amount of, frankly, scholarly work in order to be able to advance to that position. And one of the things he had done is that he had developed a theory that is called Velayat Faqih, a completely different political system in which you have a spiritual leader, an ayatollah at the top. And there were a lot of different lines of political thinking back in the 60s and 70s during within the opposition. You had some people who also wanted to some sort of a return back to Islam, but it was more of a politicalist, or it's a different approach to it. Then you had the leftists who, were more on the Marxist side, and, didn't really give much space to religion, etc. But he emerges as someone who is extremely strong, principled, one of the first to really call out the Shah. Several ayatollahs were actually kind of collaborating with the Shah. They had kind of been co-opted or bought. I mean, they were not naturally opposed, at the end of the day, so it's important to understand that. But he's just relentless in his criticism. When the U.S. signs the SOFA agreement with Iran in 1963, the Status of Forces Agreement, which essentially puts U.S. personnel in Iran above Iranian law. That's what the SOFA agreements do. I mean, this is what the Obama administration wanted in Iraq. Didn't manage to get it because the Iranians intervened and pushed the Iraqis not to sign it. And that actually ultimately helped Obama withdraw troops from Iraq, because if U.S. troops were going to be treated on the Iraqi law, it doesn't make occupation that attractive any longer.
Right.
The Shah signed that thing, and he just went at the Shah, saying that, the Shah is the American Shah. He's a servant of the Americans. This is not a nationalist Shah, etc. So he increasingly emerges, even though he had his huge critics and a lot of different folks that were against him very much, as the one that just is this type of uncompromising ayatollah against the Shah that kind of exudes the type of strength people wanted. And by the way, it's also important to understand, he held his cards very tight. He did not reveal really what he was planning to do. Look at some of those revolutionary demonstrations against the Shah. The women did not have the hijab on.
Right.
In fact, it took another 6 months before he actually pushed that through. And there were massive protests against that. So what he promised would come is not at all what the Islamic Republic became.
He used the leftists in a lot of cases.
Absolutely.
Now, you said like 6 months right there as an example of when after he came in and started now saying like, oh, by the way, we're doing hijabs and hardcore like Islamic law. But when would you say the majority of society, how long before the majority of society had quietly, silently, I might say, turned against him? Was that within a year or two, or did that take a decade?
Look, the Islamic Republic had huge problems from the beginning. You had opposition groups that were pushed out. But then you also had Saddam Hussein invading the country. And in many ways, it ended up becoming a blessing for Islam.
A blessing?
Yes, because the country completely rallies around the flag. What's most important is to expel the invader.
Common enemy.
Common enemy. And in many ways, it postponed a lot of the other internal contradictions of the Islamic Republic for a decade almost. It's not clear to me at all that the Islamic Republic would have survived by 1982 had it not been for Saddam's invasion. And so by the time the war ends, you both have a devastated country, a revolution that is a complete failure because it's not delivered. Iran is in ruins after that war. But you also have people who now have invested so heavily in this. It's not just a revolution. Their children died defending the country, right? So amongst the supporters of the Islamic Republic, the war profoundly deepened their support, because they had now sacrificed so much for it. It was just so much more difficult to walk away from something. You had such a high sunk cost. By the end of that decade, something else had changed. First of all, Khomeini was now gone. So there was politics in Iran in a different way, because Khomeini did not replace Khomeini as that type of a unquestioned ruler.
Oh, he didn't.
He was actually quite weak. He didn't even have the religious credentials fully. He wasn't an Ayatollah at the time that he was elevated to that position. He was
I didn't know that.
He was a rank below.
Huh.
He was a compromise candidate at the end of the day. And the elements that were pushing for him did so because they thought that they could take advantage of him because he was weaker. Over time, it turned out to be the other way around. He actually grew, really consolidated his own power. But he was constantly challenged. And by the end of the 1990s, 1997, something happened that was really a shock. There was an election, the presidential elections. And this former head of the state library and a minister of culture of the Rafsanjani government decides that he's throwing his hat in the ring. That Guardian Council that I mentioned allowed him to, probably thinking that he won't win, but it will give the air of legitimacy for the elections. And perhaps even push up voter participation without obviously undermining the favored conservative. Right. But no, instead you had, I think, 79% voter participation. And the guy overwhelmingly won in the first round. And it was because he's a reformist and he was saying that, the system has to reform, it has to change. And that's the beginning of that reform movement that now essentially is more or less dead.
How did they kill it?
As we talked earlier on, they failed in many different ways. But also, in my view, in my book, the Trump administration walking out of the JCPOA killed the one critical achievement they had. That was the key to the other achievements. Few people thought that, if you listen to the conventional wisdom in Washington, some of the criticism against the negotiation was like, the Iranians will never negotiate. Well, then the Iranians showed up and they were like, well, they will never negotiate honestly. Well, progress was made. Well, they will never agree to a deal. It's just not possible for the Islamic Republic to agree to a deal. Then they agreed to a deal. Then we're like, well, they're never going to actually live up to the agreement. They will cheat. Well, 14 reports by the IAEA, who was the body that was inspecting the adherence to the agreement, to say that they were doing everything they had to do. Several reports by the US State Department, twice under the Trump administration itself, certifying that the Iranians were living up to the agreement. People thought this was impossible, but it was possible. But it was key to then unlocking the economic disaster that Iran was in and be able to, as I mentioned, strengthen a middle class, slowly but surely grow. And over time, Iran could have, imperfectly, in a ways that is not perhaps in any way, shape, or form identical, but moved kind of like China. China still has a communist party, but there's nothing communist about the Chinese economic system at all in any way, shape, or form. It's a complete market economy.
But the government controls all.
The government controls, exactly.
That's pretty
So you
communist.
don't have that type of a political liberalization. So that is one path that some people wanted to go. And other elements from the reformers didn't believe that that was ever possible in Iran, that there could not be such a thing as economic liberalization without the political liberalization following suit. But as long as there's no economic liberalization, the options, the opportunities, the chances, the window for the political liberalization also just completely closed.
Yeah, I didn't realize the timeline was that long, by the way, because when you said this reform election happened in 1997, I'm assuming that was a different reform than you were talking about earlier, and you're saying it's the same thing, which means...
It's the same movement, and, in 1998, a year after, or just months into his election, he gives his presidency, Khatami gives this historic interview to Christiane Amanpour of CNN, who's herself half Iranian, grew up in Iran, half British, half Iranian, in which he says that the wall of mistrust between the United States and Iran needs to be teared down, that he wants to have a dialogue. He quotes Alex de Tocqueville and knows a lot about U.S. history, etc. And there was actually quite a lot of excitement in the Clinton administration at the time as well, that, okay, this is great, let's pursue this. And then because of problems on the Iranian side, they actually don't go down the path in the manner that they could have and should have. They did some things. When the United States suffered from 9/11, not too far away from here, and it became clear that this was done by Al-Qaeda, and this was planned out of, well, it was partly planned out of Afghanistan with the Taliban government giving Al-Qaeda space to be there. The Iranians had already been in indirect war with the Taliban for about 7-8 years. The Iranians were the ones that were arming and training the Northern Alliance and standing up against the Taliban taking over the entire country. So the US actually deals with Iran. And there's both during the war, in which the Iranians were complaining to the US that you're not bombing the right places in Afghanistan, while incidentally, Ayatollah Khomeini was giving Friday speeches condemning the United States for bombing another Muslim country. So the
going on.
Double games in politics, you have to just understand that they're there. But then after the Taliban was defeated, the much tougher task came, which was, okay, how do we make sure that Afghanistan is stable and that it has a new government and a new constitution? Then the Bush administration and the Iranian government completely coordinated the Bonn conference in Germany that got the Afghan groups together and got them to finally agree to a new constitution that established the Karzai government. And the US actually didn't have the relations or the trust with any of the Afghan parties from the Northern Alliance. Iran had them. And according to Jim Dobbins, the late Jim Dobbins, who was Reagan's, who was George W. Bush's representative there and led the negotiations, none of this was possible had it not been for the help that the Iranians gave the United States at the time. And the Iranians did so as part of the reform project, the calculation being, if Iran shows itself to be strategically useful to the United States over here, then that can pave the way for an opening between the US and Iran on other issues. What the Iranians didn't know was that the Bush administrations had made a decision. It was called the Hadley Rule in the NSC, which was that within the war on terror, it was permissible for the United States to collaborate with an enemy state tactically, but not allow that tactical collaboration translate into a strategic change in relations. Meaning, you work with them, but not with the intent of actually improving relations. You're not allowing this. So 6 weeks, about 6 weeks after the Bonn conference, 5 weeks. Bonn conference was December 10th, 2001. January, State of the Union speech of George W. Bush, I think, was in last week of January. Remember what he said in that speech? He said there is an axis of evil. Iran, North Korea, and Iraq. So after all of that collaboration, the Iranians got themselves into the axis of evil. And then you had another down. So look, there's been this dance up and down. There's been moments where the US actually have done tremendous outreach and the Iranians have not responded or they've betrayed their words. And there's been the opposite. The biggest one, though, the one that actually is a written, negotiated agreement, was the JCPOA.
Now, what is the balance of power? I don't know if you can put a percentage on it. Oh yeah, Dave, can we get water? Sorry about
Thanks,
that.
Thanks, man.
I don't know if you can put percentages on each part, but what is the balance of power, you would say, in the government? Meaning you have the supreme leader, you have the president, and then I'm going to combine a lot of things. You have the legislative body. Does the supreme leader have 70% say, the president's got 20 and legislators got 10, or does it vary?
It varies with the individuals. The current president, by design, does not even want to have much. He's just want to work in tandem with the supreme leader, so he's really not a particularly important figure. The previous president was, the one before him, unfortunately, was as well, and that was Ahmadinejad, who did all kinds of crazy things. So it varies. It's not a very set system in the sense that the institutions are crucial. The institutions are there, they're not unimportant, but the personalities within the institutions are even more important. And we are now in a situation in which Khomeini, the supreme leader, has managed to really wrap everything around his finger.
Right. That's what it feels like.
Yeah. And he is in a much, much stronger position than he was 10 years ago. And those who, and this is part of the reason why there's a belief that the reform project failed. And if you're a young Iranian, right, if you're one of the 20-year-olds, I totally understand why they're like, we don't bother with reform. We saw it fail for 20 years. Why would we waste another 20 years on that? No, we want revolution and we want it now. And we're going to do what our not parents, but perhaps our grandparents didn't just ask for a revolution instead of asking for reform.
Right.
Totally understand that. If you have 60 years ahead of your life and this reform process hasn't gone anywhere, it's totally understandable. They will be like, no, we don't have time for this. We need change right now.
But it's interesting that like when even like Netanyahu will give a speech as it relates directly to Iran, and there's all kinds obviously like blocks that they put on the internet and stuff, but when I guess like the Israelis and Americans work to get speeches like that into the country so people can see it, you'll hear about numbers like 20 million Iranians tune into this speech just because it's one issue. Like, oh, like, well, he wants to overthrow the regime and we want that too. So like, the impetus for it is there. But I want to take a step back to the 2002 protests for a minute, because I remember 2022. I remember like I was doing this show during that time. I was talking to some people about this, like this feels a little different. And then it kind of died off. So just starting there for a second, why did that not go through, and how on the ground was like CIA and Mossad at the time? I assume obviously not enough.
So look, the first thing I think one has to remember and I'm not an expert on revolutions. My brother actually is a researcher on this topic and knows much more than me. First thing you have to accept, revolutions are extremely rare, and they're extremely rare for good reason. It is not enough just to be angry. It's not enough to have a huge amount of people being really, really angry. That in and of itself does not bring about a revolution. Mm-hmm. It is oftentimes a necessary requirement, but it is not a sufficient requirement. You have a tremendous amount of anger, and you did have that in 2022. And it's perhaps important to go back. You had this Iranian woman who was visiting Tehran from her own hometown, gets called in by the morality police, accusing her of not having worn her hijab properly, and then ends up getting killed in custody. Different stories. The police said it was an accident, but clearly she was beaten up one way or another, and she was killed, died. And it just captured the country's imagination because she didn't die right away. She was hospitalized in a coma. Mm. And people were following that story, and they were very upset about this happening. And then she passes. And then you have protests that are starting to bubble up in several different places, but it looks very different from 2009 and other protests. First of all, these ones were also more middle class, whereas in 2017, you had more of a poorer classes really rising up. So this was not as economically driven at all. This was clearly more political. But this was the first time that the protesters really, well, not the first time, but at least from the middle class, to really come out, protest, and completely reject the reformists. They were not looking towards the reformist leaders as their options, as their candidates. They were like, no, we're saying no to all of you. Mm. We don't care if you're reformist or if you are in the middle or if you are a hardliner. To us, you're all the same.
Burn it down kind of
Burn
attitude.
It down, exactly. And we're not going to fall from their perspective, from the lie of thinking, oh, if we work with the reformists, that's how we get change. We haven't seen that work out. So we just want the entire political structure to be overthrown. But that then also meant that they didn't have political leaders. Mm. Because the political leaders that were still tolerated within the system were the ones who were on the reformist side, many of them in prison, but nevertheless, they were still within that framework some way, somehow. But if you're saying, no, we're actually going for people who don't want the system at all whatsoever and don't want it reformed, want it to replaced, then those leaders are not out in the open. And without leadership, it's very difficult to channel the immense energy that existed in the system, in the society, to pressure the government. And in these situations, you actually end up negotiating with the government to get rid of it or whatever the end result is. But they couldn't do that because they didn't have leadership. And there were justifications for saying, it's better not to have, we're going to have a leader-less revolution. There's no such thing. Because what happens is that there is a leadership vacuum. And that leadership vacuum ended up to a large extent being filled by elements on the outside. Mm. And those elements, most of them, from the outset, pursued a different agenda. Yes, they agreed on the core thing, No more reform, just get rid of the system as a whole. But look what they were also calling for. They were calling for more sanctions on Iran. I didn't see a single protest back then asking for more sanctions. The population has suffered tremendously from sanctions. And you can hate the regime immensely, max. You still hate the sanctions. You're not seeing the sanctions helping you. But they were pushing for sanctions. They were pushing for Iran to get kicked out of the World Cup in soccer. One of the few elements of joy that the population still have. Again, I never saw anyone inside in a meaningful numbers, but I didn't frankly see anyone call for that.
Right.
So you had elements on the outside, exiled opposition groups. Many of them have been away from Iran for 40 years, taking advantage of that leadership vacuum. In my view, and I'll get shit for it in your comment section, I don't think any of them, frankly, have shown themselves to be democratic. And part of the reason why that is crucial is not just because you need to show your democratic behavior to win support from inside the country and get defections, but it's also something you need to do to build coalitions. There was an effort to build a coalition. They got 6 of them together at Georgetown University. Within 5 weeks, they were fighting each other at each other's throats. And it was an embarrassment. And it actually really disillusioned a lot of the people inside the country that were hoping that the diaspora would be able to do something useful.
You got to be able to agree.
Yeah, but if you've spent your 45 years in the United States and you haven't picked up any democratic line of thinking, then you're not an answer. You're part of the problem, in my view.
I think you're right about that.
I mean, it's one thing if you say that someone grew up in a terrible dictatorial, communist, whatever type of a system, and you're not surrounded with it. I'm not saying our democracy is perfect, and sure as hell, it has a lot of issues right now, and I'm very worried. But nevertheless, it's a democratic system with flaws, like all of them do. And if you've been here for that long and not picked up from that, then you must have almost actively tried to not become more democratic. Yeah. And that's unfortunately the reality. And it's, it's not an insult from my end, it's just an assessment, because if it was, that coalition would have ended up working out. But it didn't. It didn't even last 5 weeks.
Yeah.
And now you have all of the, I don't know if you've seen some of these protests that are taking place outside the country with different opposition figures or groupings actually fighting each other, etc. This is very demoralizing for people inside of Iran who are not in a democratic system.
Right.
And we're hoping that people who actually have the maneuverability be able to take that with far greater responsibility than what we've seen.
Now, obviously, so that the one in 2022, that's a great explanation, by the way, of how that goes away. But we're now seeing some of those same patterns, unfortunately, outside of Iran not having solved themselves. But before we get to just these protests that are happening right now, real quickly, obviously there was something very important that you alluded to earlier that happened in June where the United States got involved with hitting Forda and some of these other facilities. But my understanding is that this was precipitated, the ability to do this and the initial strikes before that Israel carried out is because Mossad was able to get a lot of assets on the ground. I would think that Iran and the IRGC are, almost like 1984 looking for any type of Israeli influence that could be happening in their society. How were they able to get so many different agents available to get them intelligence to pull off, I have to say, it was very well executed strikes.
So it's a very important question because the Israeli intelligence penetration of Iran is beyond anything anyone had envisioned or expected. It took, I think, everyone by surprise. It certainly must have taken the Iranian government by surprise, because if they knew this, then it's even more incompetence. The first absolutely essential circumstance is that you have to have a very large critical mass of people that are so upset and angry and pissed off at the government that they're willing to consider. Because you need to have a huge number of people that have that sentiment to get a very small number of them to be willing to be flipped.
Right.
Right? Of those, that huge amount, probably not even 97% would be even willing to consider it. But to make sure that 3,000, that 3% is large enough that you actually could make the connections and everything else, the original pool has to be very large. And that then comes back to the Iranian government. Their treatment of the people have just been so poor. They have produced people willing to be assets for a foreign government inside their own, including actually helping them militarily. So this is ultimately on the Iranian government itself.
Would you say
And in the meantime, incidentally, I have to say, I've not been able to go back to Iran. I can't go back.
Right.
They made it very clear I would be taken. I would be accused of being a CIA spy if I go to Iran. And you see all of these dual citizen Iranians who have been taken. So they go after them. Whereas in reality, there's just been this massive penetration. So there's the intelligence failure on the Iranian side is far beyond the Israeli intelligence failure on October 7th. And so the Israelis themselves have openly spoken about how they've done some of these things. I'm just going to repeat to you what I've read. This is not my area of expertise. I'm not an intelligence person in any shape or form. And I'll also start off by saying, I don't know if this is what they're saying publicly because it's true or if it's actually part of the the psychological warfare between them. But what is said there is that the Mossad has various different ways of winning people over. And it's a long process. It starts off with small things that they asked him to do by offering them favors. The two most common ones, if I remember correctly, is someone has a family member that needs medical help. They offer to be able to take that person out of the country for treatment in Switzerland or whatever. That's one. The other one, promise of making sure you get into a good Canadian or American or other Western university. And that way you win over some young people. But even then, the success rate, I don't know what it is, but it's not so that everyone that they try, they succeed. Right. It's probably relatively low. But the pool has to be large.
Yeah, they're throwing a lot of fish hooks out there.
Yeah. And a lot of them have their own motivation. They have been so mistreated by the Islamic Republic. This is revenge. They think that in their mind, they're doing something very patriotic. In my view, I understand that they think so. I don't think so because I think there's a larger geopolitical dimension in which these are rival states. And Israel is not looking out for Iran's best interest. And Iran is not looking out for any of the, there's plenty of Israelis that are also being caught spying for Iran in Israel.
Really?
Oh, yes, absolutely. Nowhere near what the Israelis have managed to do in Iran. But there's a lot of that as well. And they may think that they're being patriotic. I have no idea what they're thinking. But bottom line, Iran is not looking for Israel's best interest, nor is Israel looking for Iran's best. It's just not the way.
It's a game.
Yeah, I mean, geopolitics is not a game of charity.
Right?
It's a game of competition. But anyways, they're so upset. In their view, the only real enemy is the Islamic Republic, so they're willing going this direction. What the Israeli story is that they extracted a lot of these people out of the country, trained them, and then 3 days before they attacked, they slipped them back in.
How?
Through Iran's borders are massive. Just the border with Iraq and Kurdistan is very, very long, mountainous, tremendous amount of smuggling taking place, very, very difficult to keep safe. Same thing is true of the border to the east. They get them back in, and then as the war starts, they have whatever orders, etc. But what we saw happening there is that a lot of the attacks actually were not done by Israeli F-35s or American F-35s flown by Israelis getting into Iranian airspace. They were either outside of Iranian airspace and shooting their missiles, or these cells had smuggled in components of drones, had spent the 3 days assembling them inside the country, and the attacks actually took place from inside the country. We saw the Ukrainians pull that off deep in Russia as well. Those drones did not fly from Ukraine to Russia deep in. They were smuggled in, assembled, and then flown a short distance from within Russia. Same thing was done, but probably on a much larger scale by the Israelis inside of Iran using Iranian defectors.
To get this many, though, and to be able to flip people, I mean, I'd say it's pretty safe to say, no pun intended, that means that Mossad has been able to develop plenty of their own undercover people within the country and have safe houses within Iran.
Absolutely.
Right?
I mean, even before all of this, they did this.
Right.
In fact, it's kind of interesting. The Israelis had the best intelligence in Iran back during the time of the Shah.
Yeah, they knew it was happening.
They knew what was happening. The reason for this was the Shah was very untrusting of the United States, did not allow the CIA to roam around freely. There was a very limited number of people the CIA could be in touch with. This is part of the reason why the US actually was really taken by surprise by the depth of unhappiness and was taken by surprise by the revolution as a whole. The Israeli source of intelligence was not spies. It was, at the time, 110,000 strong Iranian Jewish community who traveled extensively back and forth between Israel and Iran. And as a result, had a much better sense of what was going on inside the country. It's very interesting. When the revolution happened, the Israelis knew this. They saw it coming. They warned the US. The US didn't take it seriously. They didn't listen. And there is a scene I describe in my first book on Iran and Israel. The head of Mossad in Israel, in Iran, he was usually actually stationed in Iraq for an operation that the Iranians and the Israelis were conducting against Iraq at the time. His name is Eliezer Tzafrir. He just passed away, 92 or 93 years old, a couple of days ago, actually. He and the defense attaché go out to Tehran at Azadi Square the day when Khomeini returns to the country, and you probably have 2 million people out in the streets. They blend in. I don't know for certain, but I think they're Sephardic Jews. So I mean, they're Israelis of Middle Eastern background. So
they can blend in.
They can blend in, and they were just going there and trying to make sure that they didn't stick out in any way, shape, or form. And at one point, a revolutionary comes to them and asks them, "Why don't you have any signs with the picture of Khomeini?" And they're like, "Well, give us." So they get these signs with Khomeini's pictures, and they're sitting there chanting, "Long live Khomeini and death to Israel." And this is done by the head of Mossad in Iran at the time. They have those cells. They clearly do. It would be malpractice for them not to. This is what states do. The degree of it, again, it took everyone by surprise. But this is also part of the reason why when we see this element, violent element, amongst the protest in January 8th, etc. Yes, the Iranians always blame Israel or the US, and they say that Israel was behind every protest that have taken place. Sure. So obviously cannot just go by that. But when you have a scenario in which the Israelis are openly admitting on Israeli TV that they're there, that they trained the people, etc. When you have the former head of the CIA, Mike Pompeo, tweet the same thing and say good luck to every Iranian protester and every Mossad agent standing next to them. Now, we have to recognize two potential scenarios. Scenario one, it's true. They're doing it, and because of the June operations, they don't even bother to try to hide it any longer.
No.
Right? Or two, and it could be both. Two, this is exaggerated or perhaps even entirely false, but it's part of the psychological warfare between Iran and Israel. And as a result, they say that. But at a minimum, as an analyst...
It's probably both.
Probably both, exactly. But at a minimum, as an analyst, you can't completely dismiss the likelihood that this is happening just because the Iranian government is saying it, because now the Israeli government is saying it as well. Yeah. So at least you have to entertain that likelihood is probably not terribly small.
Yeah. It's actually interesting when you talk about going back to when the Shah was deposed. You ever read Ronan Bergman's book, Rise and Kill First? He talks about that. Yeah. About they were like, hey, guys, this is not going well. The U.S. is like, everything's fine. And then I'm like, oh, shit. Whoops. That's interesting.
And there were people at the U.S. Embassy that were sending warnings.
Yeah.
And those cables were hidden. They were not allowed. They were stopped. They were not allowed to get all the way to the top.
And 144 hostages
there's a new book. Forgot what it's called. A historian wrote it. It's very important new information, a lot of in-depth interviews with some of those people at the embassy at the time. Oral history.
If you get it after, send it to me.
Yeah. No, I have the book. I have it in my Kindle. I'll find it for you. Yeah.
Cool. Yeah. Well, where do we go from here, Trita, with what's currently happening?
I have to head to the airport. So.
That's what I'm saying. We're coming right to the end. Where do we go from here with the current 2026 protests? Like, what kind of information are we even able to get out of the country to see what's real and what's not? And, like, is this potentially a moment where there's enough cream rising to the top that you could see this thing explode from within?
I don't think there will be an explosion from within. And now, of course, this is a scenario in which you don't have war and things like that taking place. I do think, however, that the Islamic Republic is increasingly a dead man walking. There's obviously those who are, supportive of the regime, and there still are. But I think every time things like this happen, including 2022, by the way, in which a lot of conservatives were like, we want the hijab, but we don't want it to be mandatory. Why on earth are we having a big fight over this? Weakening the country, opening it up for attack, all of these different things, for manipulation, by having this civil war over this issue. This is ridiculous. So I do think that every time this happens, and what happened this time around is worse than anything else in terms of,
Death.
5,000 to 7,000 deaths, perhaps more. I mean, this is just unprecedented. And I think that further just kills amongst their own supporters. And their own supporters are already very small. I mean, we're talking about a regime that probably is in place because roughly 15 to perhaps 20% of the population support it, not more. But then you have a plurality who want to see change, but not at any cost. They do not want to see a repeat of 1979. And then you have a growing minority, perhaps a plurality at this point, but I think a growing minority who are of the view, no, this is intolerable at any cost. And this is the thing we've seen now lately. We didn't see it. Even in 2022, we didn't see that. We didn't see any calls for military intervention, for instance, in 2022 from inside the country. You do now. It's impossible for me to make an assessment how, if that's a majority, polarity, whatever, but you have that now in a way that was just simply not the case before. So I think over time, every time they do this, and this is the worst thing they've done, they actually erode the legitimacy, not amongst the larger population, they don't have much of that to begin with, but even amongst those who actually support it. And so this is not tenable in any way, shape, or form. But in my view, it's never been tenable. I never thought the Islamic Republic could survive. The question has always been, how does it fall? And does it fall in a way that actually paves the way for democracy? Or does it fall in a way that paves the way for another dictatorship, or even worse, a civil war, etc.? That question is still unanswered.
If you were a betting man, do you think in the next 5 years you'll set foot in Iran?
I would put it this way. I think within the next 5 years, this current iteration of the regime will be gone. But most likely, it will be replaced with another iteration of the same regime. Other elements of the regime will take power. I mean, remember, taking power means that you have control of the security establishment, etc. To get that to fall, as happened in the Soviet Union, you have to have defections. You have to have, we're just not seeing that. In fact, another thing that the son of the former Shah said that I thought was very clumsy if he actually wants to get an uprising from the bottom. In an interview with CBS, the anchor asked him, I was actually surprised that they said this, they asked him, do you feel a degree of responsibility? You urged people to go out and protest and thousands got killed. What is your responsibility in all of this, you sitting in Maryland, right? I think it's a fair question.
It is a fair.
You can also have a fair answer. Yeah. He gave what I thought was a very unwise answer because he said, hey, this is a war, and in war you have casualties. Well, let's break that down. First of all, was no expression of empathy and sympathy with the victims, right? But more importantly, your job in trying to get an entrenched system to collapse is to chip away at its legitimacy and delegitimize it. Now they have used an excessive amount of force. You have to delegitimize the use of force. By you calling it a war, and that war has casualties, you indirectly legitimize it. Because if it's a war for you, then it's a war for them.
Yeah.
And if it's a war for them, then they're going to act as if it's a war. And in war, according to Reza Pahlavi, there are casualties. That's just such an unwise answer. For someone who says that he's been preparing himself for this moment for 47 years, I expected a bit more.
Shitty preparation. Trita Parsi, we got to get you to the airport, as you said. Otherwise, we'd keep going. But this has been an amazing education on a lot of things.
Thank you.
In the region
Thank you so much
today.
for giving me the opportunity. Usually you get like 3.5 minutes on CNN, so this is
3.5
Luxury.
plus 257 right here. That's what we like. But thank you so much, sir.
Thank
All
you.
right,
Thank
we
you so
will-
much for having me.
We'll link your socials down below and
Please do.
everything. And I'm wishing the Iranian people all the best.
Thank you so much.
All right, everybody else, you know what it is. Give it a thought. Get back to me. Peace. Thank you guys for watching the episode. If you haven't already, please hit that subscribe button and smash that like button on the video. They're both a huge, huge help. And if you would like to follow me on Instagram and X, those links are in my description below.